In the world of global energy, few shifts have been as dramatic or as swift as India's sudden embrace of Russian crude oil. This transformation didn't just alter trade statistics, it sent shockwaves through the global oil market, challenging long-standing alliances and economic assumptions. Before 2022, Russia was barely a blip on India's oil import radar. For years, India's energy needs were met almost entirely by Middle Eastern suppliers, with Iraq and Saudi Arabia consistently topping the list. These established relationships were built on decades of reliable supply and mutual economic benefit, making the sudden shift all the more remarkable. But everything changed after the Ukraine conflict erupted in early 2022. In response, Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, including a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil. These measures were designed to squeeze Russia's economy, but they also forced Moscow to urgently seek out new buyers for its vast oil reserves, as traditional European markets closed their doors. India, a country that imports over 85% of its oil, saw a unique opportunity. Russian companies, desperate to keep their oil flowing, began offering their flagship Urals crude at steep discounts, sometimes $15 to $20 below the global Brent benchmark. For India, this wasn't just a bargain, it was a strategic windfall that could help ease the country's massive energy bill and support its fast-growing economy. For Indian refiners, the decision was clear. Buying discounted Russian oil allowed them to cut costs dramatically and boost their profit margins. This was a pragmatic, business-driven move, one focused on economics, not politics. Indian companies negotiated new contracts, adapted their refineries to process Russian crude, and ramped up imports at an unprecedented pace. Within just a few months, India had overtaken every other nation to become the top destination for Russian seaborne oil. The global oil trade map was redrawn almost overnight, with shipping routes shifting dramatically toward Indian ports. This realignment not only benefited India and Russia, but also forced other oil exporters to rethink their strategies in a rapidly changing market. Ultimately, this was a powerful example of market logic at work. Economic incentives rather than political alliances reshaped the world's energy landscape, proving that in the global oil game, pragmatism often trumps ideology. The numbers tell the story. Behind every data point lies a dramatic shift in global energy flows, and nowhere is this more evident than in India's oil imports. Over the past few years, the landscape has changed in ways few could have predicted, with Russian crude at the center of this transformation. Before 2022, Russian oil was a minor player in India's vast energy market, making up just 2% of the country's total crude imports. Most of India's oil came from the Middle East, with countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia dominating the scene. Russian barrels were rare, and trade between the two nations in this sector was limited. But everything changed when Western sanctions hit Russia in early 2022. Suddenly, Russian oil was available at steep discounts, and Indian refiners saw an opportunity. They ramped up purchases at an unprecedented pace, taking advantage of lower prices and favorable terms. By the end of 2022, Russia had leapfrogged into the top tier of India's suppliers, fundamentally altering the country's energy map. By 2023, the numbers were staggering. Russian oil accounted for up to 45% of India's imports, over 1.5 million barrels every single day. This was a seismic shift, not just in volume but in the very structure of India's energy security. Ports bustled with Russian tankers, and refineries adapted to process new grades of crude. This surge in Russian imports displaced traditional suppliers, pushing long-standing partners like Iraq and Saudi Arabia down the ranks. For the first time, Russia became India's #1 source of crude oil, but this rapid growth was not destined to last forever. As global markets adjusted and new risks emerged, the trend began to slow. By late 2025, Russian imports had dropped to around 1.1 to 1.3 million barrels daily, making up just 27% of India's crude basket. The era of unchecked Russian growth was over, replaced by a more cautious approach as India sought to balance its energy needs with geopolitical realities. Indian energy executives and policymakers recognized the risks of overdependence. They began to diversify once again, reaching out to old partners and exploring new sources. The focus shifted to building a resilient supply chain capable of withstanding global shocks and price volatility. India's import mix shifted again, as risk management and supply security took center stage. The country's strategy evolved, prioritizing flexibility and long-term stability over short-term gains. The market had adapted, and so had India. In a world of constant change, India's energy sector proved its ability to pivot, ensuring the nation's growth and prosperity remained on track. The reason for India's Russian oil spree was simple: price. Private giants like Reliance and Nayara snapped up discounted Urals crude, saving billions and boosting margins. State-owned refiners soon followed, as the government prioritized affordable energy for its vast population. The logistics were complex: shadow fleets, non-Western insurance, but the savings were too big to ignore. By 2023 and 2024, India's import bill shrank, inflation was cushioned, and refiners thrived. The government's stance was clear: economic interests came first. For a time, the interests of refiners and the nation aligned perfectly. It was a textbook case of market forces at work. By 2025, the economics changed. Russian discounts shrank from $15–20 to just $3–7 per barrel. The extra costs, longer shipping, shadow fleet risks, complex payments began to outweigh the benefits. Refiners reconsidered: why take on more risk for less reward? The shadow fleet's aging tankers and opaque ownership raised the stakes for accidents and sanctions. Major players like Reliance scaled back Russian purchases, prioritizing stability over short-term savings. The industry got the message. The easy money was gone. India's oil strategy shifted from opportunism to caution. The risk calculus changed further as U.S. sanctions tightened in 2024-25. The U.S. began targeting not just Russian oil, but the ships and traders moving it, blacklisting vessels and companies. For Indian refiners, one misstep could mean payment issues, insurance headaches, or reputational damage. Private firms like Reliance, exposed to global markets, slashed Russian imports to avoid trouble. Even some state-owned refiners pulled back. The threat of legal and financial penalties outweighed shrinking discounts. U.S. diplomatic pressure, including tariffs, added to the urgency. India's refiners responded by diversifying, seeking safer, more reliable supply chains. The era of risk-taking was over. Caution now ruled. As India cut back on Russian oil, new suppliers stepped in. Angola, Brazil, and the UAE ramped up exports, offering familiar crude grades and established shipping routes. OPEC's share of India's imports rebounded, and Brazil's unique crude found new buyers. The absence of sanctions made these sources more attractive and reliable. India's diversification was strategic, reducing vulnerability to disruptions and learning from its Russian experience. The global oil market proved flexible. Barrels rerouted, new partnerships formed. For India, it wasn't about rejecting Russia, but returning to a balanced, secure supply mix. The market adapted, and so did India's refiners. These shifts in the global oil market have real and tangible consequences for Indian consumers, touching nearly every aspect of daily life. Whether you're a commuter, a business owner, or a family managing monthly expenses, the price you pay at the pump is directly influenced by these international developments. For millions of Indians, fuel costs are not just a number. They shape household budgets, transport choices, and even the cost of essential goods and services. Discounted Russian oil played a crucial role in keeping fuel prices stable and inflation in check throughout 2023 and 2024. This stability offered much-needed relief to families and businesses, helping them weather global economic uncertainties and maintain their standard of living. But as India is now forced to turn to pricier alternatives, import costs are set to rise, even if only modestly at first. This means petrol and diesel prices at the pump will likely inch upward, putting extra pressure on household budgets and potentially increasing the cost of transportation and goods across the country. The government may step in to cushion the blow, possibly through subsidies or tax adjustments, but the era of deep discounts and ultra-cheap fuel is coming to an end. Policymakers now face the challenge of balancing fiscal responsibility with the need to protect consumers from sudden price shocks. On the positive side, India's move to diversify its oil suppliers brings greater energy security and resilience. By spreading its risk across more countries, India is less vulnerable to disruptions from any single source, making the nation's energy future more stable and reliable. However, not everyone will benefit equally. Some companies, like Nayara Energy, which invested heavily in Russian crude, now face tough adjustments. They must quickly adapt their sourcing strategies and operations to cope with the new reality. Financial entanglements, such as dividends stuck in Russian banks due to sanctions and payment restrictions, add another layer of complexity for Indian businesses operating internationally. These challenges can impact profitability and long-term planning. The transition is undoubtedly challenging, but it's a strategic move aimed at ensuring India's long-term energy stability and economic resilience. For Indian consumers, the coming years will bring both adjustments and opportunities as the country navigates this new energy landscape. India's retreat hasn't stopped Russian oil exports. Instead, Russian barrels are finding new buyers, sometimes in surprising places. The UAE and Brazil, both oil producers, have increased imports of discounted Russian crude for refining and re-export. The shadow fleet still moves much of this oil, despite tighter enforcement and higher costs. The market has split. Sanctioned oil moves through opaque channels, while non-sanctioned oil uses mainstream routes. Russian oil volumes remain steady, but profits are squeezed by discounts and logistics. Sanctions haven't stopped the flow, they've just made it more complex and costly. The global oil market, once again, adapts. India's Russian oil saga is a lesson in market pragmatism. When discounts were deep, India bought big, saving billions and stabilizing its economy. As risks rose and discounts faded, India pivoted, diversifying its suppliers. This wasn't about politics, but about securing affordable, reliable energy. Sanctions and geopolitics rerouted trade, but didn't stop it. Oil kept flowing, first to India, then to new buyers as India stepped back. India's strategy: seize opportunity, then adapt when the landscape changes. In the end, markets, not politics, decide where the oil goes.